What's going on, everybody? My name is Kyle, and I make music under the name Outwild. Thanks so much for tuning in with me today in my cramped little studio here in Toronto, Canada, to go over my new single, Golden. Just a quick shout out to She Is Jules. She did a stellar job laying down the top line for this track. You can follow her on social media. We'll place a tag or a link in the description or something like that. So without further ado, let's get into it. Okay, so I have the Golden project set up here. I do have a lot of weird grouping and stuff like that going on. I'll get to that a little bit later. We'll break this down into parts, I guess. Typically when I start a song, I start out with the chords. So we're going to take a look at that to get started. I've opened up the pads group here. This is kind of where the initial chord progression comes in. And I do repeat this throughout the track. I don't think there's too much variation going on with it. We do break down to some halftime drum beats and stuff like that later on, but I just really like the overall feel, so I stuck with this. Building a song from scratch, I like to start with a chord progression and then maybe add in some textural elements, and then from there I'll add in some lead stuff and arpeggios, and yeah, we'll take a quick listen, broken down. It just kind of sets the overall feel and emotion for the track. I usually like to add like a drone in there too. Just add some texture, just a little bit of like distortion and grain. And then paired with that, yeah, we have some of our lead elements. So there's like the main lead that comes in the beginning. And this kind of trails all throughout the first part as well as comes in during the second verse. So that is this little sparkle thing here. And I did start out with the reverse. So in order to do that, all you need to do, especially if you're using Ableton, is basically you can duplicate this track. And then you set it up just so that it's just that one note that you want to reverse. And then I usually will just toss on like an Ableton stock reverb, and we'll crank the dry wet all the way up to 100% and add a little bit of decay time and set the quality to high, get rid of any of the filtering that's happening, and then we can solo it. And then we have our reverse track already set up down here. So what you do is in your audio input, it's normally set to no input. You go up to the very top and there's this resampling thing. So that means that anything coming out of the master is going to be brought into the track. So if you just have one thing soloed, then that's going to be resampled into this track and you'll be able to manipulate it from there. I'm going to take some of this mastering stuff off because we don't want that. Like if you are working with a mastering rack, maybe you're adding these things on kind of near the end. If you're already in that phase where you've done some mixing and mastering, and you don't really want that to affect what is being resampled, just be sure to turn those things off. So now we can go on here, and if we hit record, might not seem like much, but we can drag this up and we get a little bit of that trail. And all that we're going to do from there is we'll tighten this up. That's probably fine in terms of length. Hit Command or Control J to consolidate that. And then you just hit the reverse button down here. And so if I bring that volume up as well so we can hear it, it's just a little bit of this kind of reverse trail that comes in. So in the final track, it ends up sounding like this. And then using the same leads group, we want to add in different things that are kind of going to augment everything that's going on right now. There is the vocal sitting over top, so you don't want to complicate things too much because that's going to take away from that top line. But we have a couple of leads going on. So there's this monophonic lead. Which has a really nice glide to it and just kind of adds some ambience. And slowly filtering that in. And on top of that, we have these little, I would call them kind of flourishes. They're just small arpeggios that only happen sometimes. So when you listen to it all together.
Golden, golden, honestly, you know it. Me under the street light at the so I could show you.
So also, what would electronic music be without bass? In this intro part, I definitely wanted to have it a little bit more toned down just because I wanted this to really feel like an introduction to what's going to happen later on. I find that if you come in too heavy with like a really solid sub or something like that, it's just a little bit too abrasive. To get this started, we have actually this mid bass here, with just like a nice filtered sawtooth, which sets the tone before the sub and another additional bass come in. And that comes in with the drums and it creates this really nice warm feeling. And speaking on texture a little bit, I do tend to add in vocal layers that are not part of the lead vocal and usually not even drawn from the vocal artist recording at all. So these are created using various different vocal plugins. I use Exhale quite a bit. It's by a company called Output. It's a really, really awesome vocal plugin. They have a ton of really great presets as well as an audio engine for you to build your own sounds, but I do highly recommend it for anyone that wants to add in some nice vocal layers. So listening to some of those, I do have a lot of these drone sections going with these various vocal patches. And I also have an auto pan on this one, so it kind of adds some space and goes from left to right. This one's a little bit more of a fluttery sound. But again, just a drone. It's going to play those 2 octave notes indefinitely. So it just adds, again, like that layer of texture. And then I created this little vocal chop that you can't even really hear that much, but I do think that it just kind of adds to the overall body of this vocal section. And that sounds like this. And all that I did with that was I actually did that same resampling technique that we were talking about, did that, but with a vocal chop pattern that I made using the Exhale plugin. So that was originally from, I believe, some of these sounds. And all that is a preset that came with Exhale. So I would write that out in MIDI, the kind of different parts of it that I wanted to use, and then from there resampled it and then chopped up the resampled audio. And that's how you get that nice just little layer that sits in the back. So now that we've introduced all of our different elements into that verse, and it's been a nice progressive and gradual introduction of those different sounds, we're going to start adding in some drums, and that will help bring up the energy. And we can also start introducing the lead melody, which it's all eventually going to come to the forefront in the drop. So to get the drum started, I figured like this kind of chill, a little bit broken up beat. I like to have all of my drums on individual tracks. Ableton has a great feature called the drum rack that allows you to contain multiple samples within one track. And although I do like to use this especially like categorically, so my kick will have a bunch of different kick samples in it. My snare will have a bunch of different snare samples. It's easy to combine and kind of manipulate those sounds within each track, which is nice. But I do like having just a clear-cut track for each individual part of a drum kit so that way you're able to fine-tune things a lot easier, especially when it comes to the mixing phase. So as our verse is building up, we introduce our drums, which is kind of this disjointed beat here. No like consistent kicks or anything like that, just a really, really slow groove. I'm using a muted kick here. I think it does play really nicely with kind of more of the toned down verse sections. I like to cut up a lot of loops. I never really used to use loops all that much before, but I did realize like how much time it saves and also how easy it is to stack all these different parts together to make this really nice, fully produced drum beat. So you notice a lot throughout this project that I use Sounds of Kashmir, Volumes 1, Volume 2. They're great libraries of samples and I've used them in a lot of my productions, mainly because it's everything you need is kind of a one-stop shop. It has all different sorts of sounds and samples and loops and stuff, so it's easy to get ideas started. I recommend having a library like that just in your toolkit so that if you're trying to get something out of your head and into a project, then it's just a lot easier to do that. You spend less time going through different samples, different loops, and what have you. So in this case, this used to be a clap loop, and I've just cut out this one little clap part. Mainly just because I like the clap, but I also like some of the reverse effect that's going on with it. I didn't need the rest of the full beat. So I just took this, and this is actually most of the clap for this intro part. It is the clap for the intro part. So our drum section all together with the song is sounding like this.
You're golden, golden, honestly, you know it. Me under the street light at the so I could show you.
It's just enough to drive a little bit of rhythm without taking over the tone too much. Let me end it with this little fill before we dive into the more complete beat in the build-up.
So that I could show you, you're golden. Yeah, you're golden.
So we're keeping a really similar drum pattern to what we had going on in the verse, but we're just adding a few extra notes and hits and stuff here and there. For example, that clap loop versus hitting every other bar, it's now hitting every bar. We add this cinematic drum loop. There's a little shaker loop going on in some of the higher frequencies. We have this new hat pattern that is a playback of samples using Ableton's drum rack. And we also have this snare roll that comes in, which really implies a building of tension. And that is combined with kind of trap, more 808 style snare that comes in for the second half of the build-up. And then it ends on that final snare hit, tossing you right into the drop. So this is probably a good time to talk about sound effects. Sound effects really help meld your song together. From reverse cymbals to long sweeps, short impacts, and exhaust, it really adds a special flavor to the overall song. It's kind of the glue that brings everything together. It just helps transition from one section to another and helps add some of the other elements that instruments themselves just can't. And I think that using a combination of a bunch of different types of sound effects is very important to make your song sound unique, but also to make it sound full. So for example, here in the beginning, we're using this reverse cymbal sound to transition from the intro into the verse.
Denim jeans, broken dreams in my pocket.
And then in the build-up, we have these two sweeps combined that add to the already building tension provided by our drum track. And it's just filled in the background with noise so that it builds that tension, something that you eventually want released to add some clarity to your song. And a quick little mixing tip on your master channel, if you put a utility plugin and drop the gain as the buildup happens, as well as take the width and bring that down to around 30%, you'll find that it really narrows your song as the track is building up, and then it allows you to go back to a full stereo width when the drop happens. It kind of confuses the brain a little bit to make you think that the drop is sounding wider than the rest of the song, which is kind of a cool effect. It just helps with the impact of it. Okay, so for the drop. So there's two different drops that happen in this song. They're both the same tempo, but the second one is a halftime drop. It just makes it a little bit more emotional and euphoric, in my opinion. So the body of the drop comes from these big supersaw chords that I have playing, and then that paired with just a really rich sub bass, and then kind of a distorted sawtooth bass playing some lower notes. Sounds like this. So you'll notice when we hear that back that there's this big pumping effect going on. I'm sure a lot of people know about this because it's used in almost every single electronic track out there. But it's a method called sidechain compression. So basically what I have is two ghost tracks in the drum group that are playing back the same kick sample, but you can't audibly hear them. So that is the snare sidechain and the kick sidechain. So they both have the same sample on them. I use ghost channels because I find that it's a lot easier to get consistent results from both the kick and the snare. In the past, I would try using sidechain compression on the actual snare sample itself, and it was just too weak to compare with the kick. So this way I know exactly how that compressor is going to react to that audio input. It just allows you to fine tune things a little bit better. So what gives it the pumping breathing effect is that every single time that one of those ghost tracks plays through the compressor, it will duck the volume in relation to the input volume. And that gives you that pump. And you'll be able to see it here. You'll see the orange bar come down when the signal comes through. And that really helps your drums sit in the mix better, and it adds just this cool organic effect to your chord section. So my main lead, excuse the naming for all of these MIDI tracks, I used to produce music under the name of Nookshook, and I developed over a few years this really kind of nice signature piano that I really wanted to carry over to the Outwild brand. So I just called it a Nookshook Trance Piano, and because the track was named that when this MIDI clip was written, it just carried over. So the lead is broken down into a few different layers. I'll go through them really quickly for you. So a little bit more like a harsher sawtooth type thing. It's even using like the basic shapes. here in Serum. It's a pretty harsh, like tinny sounding lead. That's that signature piano I was talking about, which is essentially just a grand piano with a ton of multi-band compression, some reverb, and a lot of EQ to kind of keep everything toned down and kept together. Yeah, with that you get a little bit more of plucked kind of sound, just a little bit of envelope filtering and stuff like that to keep the sustain and release a little bit shorter. I find that it helps with the overall attack of the sound. So if you really do want to hear those initial notes being played versus just the resonance of them, it's good to kind of layer those on top of each other. And yeah, that one is just a really kind of airy sounding sawtooth lead, but all of them together sound like this. So I didn't start getting into sound design until probably late last year, which is kind of surprising for someone who's been producing music for a long time now. But I did rely a lot on presets. I thought of it in the same way as, like, you know, you're a guitarist, you pick up the guitar off the wall and then you play it. And that's kind of, you know, where you get your sounds and tones from. So I didn't spend a lot of time, plus there's many professional sound designers out there making really awesome preset packs and stuff like that. So this is how I used to do my own sound design. I would stack these different sounds together in order to get a final result that I was happy with. So in this, for example, you can hear all the individual elements that were used in creating that final sound, from the initial attack of that pluck and the piano to some of the more resonance of the like sawtooth lead in the back. So in trying to give the drums a little bit more energy, we took off all of the low pass filtering that was going on with the kick, and we're using an actual snare now versus the claps that we had in the intro. Otherwise, for the first phrase, I did still want the drums to be a little bit more stripped down so that way there's room to add elements in the second phrase of the drop. And then for the second phrase, it just adds in a shaker and a hi-hat. But you can definitely hear the ramp up of energy when you go from this to that. So again, with this part, it's kind of a combination of some new elements, but also reusing some of the things from the first verse. So a lot of the bass and chords and those vocal textures that we were talking about earlier are being reused in this part as well. The only difference now is that we have a drum beat to kind of be the driving force behind everything, tossing the low pass filter on the kick again. So it just helps to bring down the energy a little bit. And I really felt like that was enough just to kind of bring you through this part. And then we start introducing more drum elements as we get into the second part of the second verse. It's just a fluctuation of energy. That's what it all is. So then we have this impact section that completely cuts out that energy that we were building in the second half of the second verse. And one thing that I did here is that when it goes into this new section, there's no chord progression anymore. I kind of like it because it's like jumping off a cliff and then finding yourself as everything kind of slowly builds back in. And then we have the chords coming up. And the lead building up too. Here it's getting narrower because we're bringing in the stereo with the mono. And yeah, for the second verse, I made the initial drum beat halftime. I think that it adds a sense of euphoria to this part of the song. It's kind of like that final release. And it trudges along that way for the whole first half of the drop. And then there is this fill that tosses you back into the original timing of the song. And then it's kind of this full reprise. You have the vocal come back in, and that leads you to the very end. So this is probably a good time to talk about vocals. So the original stem that Jules sent over, although it says wet, it is a fairly dry stem. We can listen to it right now. It'll be super quiet because I turned my mastering rack off, so you can just hear how it sounded in the beginning.
Denim jeans, broken dreams in my pocket.
So it's definitely an awesome foundation to start. I'll turn the mastering rack back on. Okay, so the mastering rack is going to do its job and kind of bring things up a little bit just so that you guys can hear it okay.
Denim jeans, broken dreams in my
Still fairly dry though. So the first thing that I add is an EQ8 to cut out the low end of her vocal, because you'll be able to see on the graph here where, like, what frequency she's actually hitting. And anything beneath where it's most prominent is not necessary.
denim jeans, broken dreams in my pocket.
So you see how there's not really anything happening below 300 hertz. So we cut that out. I did notice as well that there was a little bit of a resonant peak just slightly above that. So I just made this quick little subtractive dip here. So next up, we're going to try and do some kind of subtractive saturation. So normally the saturation would happen in the higher frequencies, in which you're boosting those up. So it makes the vocal sound a little bit more crisp and airy. In this case, we're going to be doing it in a subtractive sense. We're bringing down some of those lower, more mid-range frequencies. So it's essentially still that same idea of boosting the highs, but instead we're just bringing down the lows and mids. It'll just give us a little bit more headroom to work with as we go along this chain.
Denim jeans, broken dreams in my pocket.
Already sounding a little bit better. So next we can actually add, this is a saturator plugin. It comes built in with Ableton. It's essentially a distortion plugin with a bunch of different presets and stuff that you can play around with. We have it set to analog clip. This is going to increase the overall volume of the vocal by about 6 dB. So the result will be very obvious, but it does help to bring up the volume of the vocal as well as add a little bit of character through some mild distortion.
Denim jeans, broken dreams in my pocket.
It just brings it to the forefront a little bit in that sense. Next up, we have a vocal compressor by Waves. It's the RVox Mono. So we have our threshold set around -13, and then some makeup gain as well.
Denim jeans, broken dreams in my pocket.
For anyone who doesn't know what compression does, it basically brings up things that are lower in volume and squashes down things that are higher in volume, kind of giving you this more average sound. So for stuff like vocals, it's really great because regardless of how close or far they were from the mic, or how strong or weak a specific breath or line of words were, it helps to kind of average that out, and it gives you an easier signal as a producer to work with. So next up, we have some multiband dynamics. Again, these are pretty subtle, but it really adds clarity to the various bands of that. Your lows, your mids, your highs.
Denim jeans, broken dreams in my pocket.
So following that, we have some parallel compression, which is using Ableton's glue compressor. If you're not using Ableton and are interested in using a glue compressor, the one by Cytomic is built into Ableton, but I believe that you can get it as a separate VST as well. And so we're just doing some like brick wall compression here. We have the attack set up to 10, releases down to 2, ratios all the way up to 10. And we're having this signal run in parallel to our dry signal. So just gonna add some body to it. You're gonna get a combination of that dry signal, which still, despite being compressed a few times already, has a little bit more dynamics to it, to this totally squash sounding vocal.
Denim jeans, broken dreams in my pocket.
So the totally compressed signal all on its own that we're running in parallel to the dry signal sounds like this.
Denim jeans, broken dreams in my pocket.
And so it just kind of adds a little bit of a layer of texture and body to that dry signal. It does sound fairly similar. If you're listening on headphones, you might be able to hear just how compressed it is, but it helps strengthen the vocal without giving too much up in the way of dynamics. So now we're on to some effects. I'm using an Ableton Audio Effect Rack. I feel like it's a great way for you to organize your effects. So I have my dry signal chain, which is always coming in full. We're doing the same thing over here as well with the parallel compression, but you have your dry chain, and then you can add additional effects on separate chains. So that way you can have them work in parallel versus working in series. Because if you work in series with certain effects, especially things like reverb, it's really going to wash out your initial dry vocal, and it's going to be harder to hear it in the final product. So along with our dry chain, we have this reverb. This is just an Ableton stock reverb using some of its pretty bass settings, just knocked the quality up to high and increased the decay time a little bit. And you'll see here that I have this echo set up. There was something I was toying around with and didn't leave in the final product of the song. It was just a little bit too much, but a quick little tip on using an echo as well. If you're using it on something like a lead vocal, you can add a compressor to the end of the chain and use the side chain in the same way as you would the kick and snare that we talked about earlier. You can side chain it to the dry signal of the lead vocal. So that way these effects can be ducked down by the incoming dry vocal. It just lets the lead vocal stand out more in the mix. So it's pretty much the end of the chain. One thing that I did add too, in hindsight, I probably should have added this earlier on in the chain. So Auto-Tune Access by Antares is going to keep our vocal in key. I want to make sure that it's humanized because I don't want to get that kind of like, early 2000s hip hop pop stuff where you can really hear the pitch shift between different notes that the vocal is singing. So this is just going to help kind of keep it more within the vocal range of the scale. And then after that, we have a reverb that's being used as an insert effect with the dry wet set fairly low. This is just to kind of help blend all of this stuff that we've been doing together, so it sounds kind of like one cohesive track. That about does it for this little walkthrough and tutorial. I hope that you're able to get something out of it and it gave you a little bit of perspective on my production process. Once again, my name is Outwild. You can follow me on social media at It's Outwild. I also stream on Twitch every Wednesday at 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific at twitch.tv/itsoutwild. Thanks so much to NCS for having me on to talk about my latest single, Golden. Until next time, have a good one.